Hello everyone, welcome to SI UK Japan webinar. Thank you for joining us today. We are now live with Lancaster University. Over to you, Atsuko.
はい、本日はセミナーにお越しいただきましてありがとうございます。SIUK 大阪オフィスの広田と申します。今日は、ランカスター大学で言語学を学ぼうというセミナーになります。言語学、TESOL だったりとか、ラングエッジスタディーズで有名なランカスター大学で言語学を集中して学べるというものになります。でランカスター大学なんですけど、10月15日金曜日に行われるオンライン留学フェアにも参加予定ですので、担当官と直接面談をしたいという方は、留学フェアの方にもお越しいただければと思います。なので、プレゼンテーションをまずさせていただいて、最後に質疑応答のお時間を設けます。ご不明点とか特に質問がある方は、プレゼンテーションが終わった後に15分間の間で質問をしてください。Will you please start your presentation, Dr. Potts?
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for attending. I have to say the sun is coming out here in Lancaster, but I recognize how lovely it is in Japan when in the autumn. And I hope you've had a lovely harvest or a fall holiday recently, and that you're enjoying the break from the hot, humid summer that I know you've had. In this talk, really, I am focused on those who have an interest in language education and who are wrestling with some of the changes that the field is experiencing and continues to experience. I know that there's a new textbook coming out, or a new set of guidance on textbooks in Japan. I suspect that you will see things in that are familiar, but also things that ask change of you, from communicative to task-based, and the continuing emphasis on CLIL that you're seeing in Japan. But I'm not going to talk about any of those things. I'm going to be talking from the perspective of, if you will, what's hot in research. What are the changes we're seeing in the discussions about what is language and what that means for language educators? And I'm going to make connections, I hope, to foreign language teaching in particular, and what that means for you. I will be drawing on examples taken from the dissertations of MA students at Lancaster, and also from one Japanese PhD student who I have currently, who's teaching south of Tokyo. So I'll be talking about language in teaching. How do we talk about language when we're talking about teaching? And then I'm going to talk about some of the challenges to the very notion of language, and think through some of the demands that's placing on those who consider language education or educational linguistics their field. I'll touch then on implications for foreign language thinking or teaching, but I do want to leave you thinking and not with answers, because if you're interested in postgraduate studies, then postgraduate studies is very much a process of engaging in wondering and asking questions and moving towards answers, but never completely having an answer. So what do we talk about when we talk about language? Well, I mean, there's the classic examples of what you would learn about if you took a standard linguistics course. You would talk about phonemes, the smallest units of sound, of distinction, morphemes, the smallest unit of meaning, words, and word is a funny word. It isn't actually a linguistic unit. It doesn't have meaning. So we talk about lexis and we talk about grammar. The next largest unit is a phrase, and above that a clause. Interestingly, in linguistics and in language education, historically, the largest unit we've actually worked with is a sentence. And a sentence isn't really a linguistic unit. We don't talk in sentences. If you tape a conversation, regardless of what language it's in, people aren't talking in sentences. They're talking in phrases and clauses and combinations of clauses. But historically, people used to imagine a sentence and write it down. And a lot of where linguistics began was from these imaginary sentences, these things that popped into people's head. Technology has changed what we study and how we gather information about language and language use. So now we talk about genres, and we talk about registers, and we talk about discourses. All of these are patterns of language use that are above the clause. That is, what I'm doing now is a presentation. How does that get organized? What genre am I speaking in? Or what register? How do I speak to you in contrast to how I might speak to students that I know, or if I was doing an academic presentation? And discourses are something else again, discourse being a very slippery word. But what you see as you go from this small unit phoneme to up to these larger units, these stretches of text, is that we're talking about language in use. And increasingly within language education and linguistics itself, over the last certainly more than 20 years, we've been looking at language in use. And even more so, language as it is used. And that's where we see our ideas about language and about what we're teaching shifting. What's going on in our classrooms? How does that connect to how research is changing our very ideas about language? What does that mean for us as teachers if we're educators? And I do want to touch upon and how that connects to issues of equality, diversity, and social justice, not simply because that's topical, but because Japan in the post-World War II world has played a key role in the development of nations. And certainly in my experience working with Japanese study abroad students and with students who we have here at Lancaster, they have gone and worked internationally with an eye to changing the world for the better. So how do we think about language as part of that process? Well, here's one of the questions that is being asked. Is there such a thing as language? Can we count language? In the brain, are there languages? Or is there just one meaning system? Here's some data from one of my MA students who just finished. She was looking at Chinese MA students working on their dissertations in a number of different subject areas. And she had them send screenshots of handwritten notes or preparatory notes or summaries, anything they were doing as part of preparing their dissertations. And they sent screenshots. And then they sent a little voice message to go with it. If we think of this as a text, what language is it in? Is it in a language or is it in languages? Could you make sense of it if you think of it as two languages? Can the languages function separately, or to understand the text, do you need both? And the audio that accompanied it as she talked about what she was doing. And this is the transcription. We have been talking about multilingualism and the function of multilingualism in language education for more than 40 years. That's a 40. The concepts, though, of how we understand these differences are exploding. Translanguaging, multilingualism, plurilingualism, heteroglossia, code messaging, and I could go on and on. How do we make sense of what it is that people do with language? And for anyone who knows languages, which is really pretty much everyone, a person who knows one language is unusual in the world. How do they talk about it? Plurilingualism is one way that we've discussed it. Here's an example from a Canadian classroom, actually, where they're making sense of an exhibit in a London museum. And they're looking at slides from this London museum. And in this exhibit, there is English and Spanish. In this class, in a typical mainstream classroom, there were kids with more than 8 different tongues that they spoke at home, in addition to how English itself was being used. And the teacher is giving a commentary on how languages make their place or are found in a classroom. And so the 2 Spanish speakers, if we call Spanish a separate language, are translating. Although you should know that they had difficulty making themselves understood with each other, because one was from the Dominican Republic and one was from Guatemala originally. And their Spanish is were not the same. They had different words for things. They used phrases differently. And the teacher is sharing this not as audio, but as something you can see, and that will become important later on. Here's the teacher talking about another instance of students using their full linguistic repertoire. And linguistic repertoire is a phrase we use more and more. This is an open house where the parents come to the classroom, and the teacher talks about how the students are flipping between languages. For example, flipping between English and Cantonese when they're talking with their parents. They mesh, if we use the idea of code meshing. They code switch, although that's used less and less because people aren't consciously saying, now I'll use English and now I'll use Cantonese, or now I'll use Japanese and now I'll use English. They fuse into a seamless stream of communication. And the teacher is talking about the importance of that, but also the kind of intellectual work that was required to set up so that everyone was comfortable communicating in a way that was most effective in this open house. Why was that important? Well, we were talking to the students about that several months later as part of this very large research project. And here's a student who said her mother simply would not have come to the open house. She would have been the child whose parents didn't attend because her mother was uncomfortable in English-only settings. But when Cantonese was there, when there was a display of language of which she was comfortable in, the mother felt comfortable to attend. This is perhaps less an issue in some settings within Japan, although certainly I know you have populations of people of Japanese heritage, for example, from Peru, who then are studying in Japan. But this kind of complexity of understanding language and the ways we use language is important for thinking about in teaching, as we saw with the MA students completing their dissertations. And it's pushed our ideas about what is language. And so the term you would use, or the concept you would hear most frequently in academic circles right now and in research-oriented teachers, is translanguaging, which is a term that has come to have 10 different definitions. So, there's the word, but there are about 10 different concepts attached. There's the long-standing use, which is thinking about designing for teaching, strategically making use of students' linguistic repertoires to further the advancement of the additional language. So, for example, using Japanese to help students understand English better. Now, that might be different than the practices you engage now. This is a very different way of thinking than grammar translation, and it's not translation. The Basque and the Catalan population in Spain, there's some terrific research going on there. But is this kind of strategic use? More like what you just saw. But then there are others who talk about translanguaging more as that continuous stream. What you saw in the MA students' data and in the work of students working on their dissertations, that a language doesn't begin and end. The communication or the meaning or the text really is meshed together with resources from multiple languages. And this is now being explored further in terms of a psycholinguistic theory. What is it, if you think of language as a cognitive practice, as the brain functioning, is language really separate that way that we used to talk about first language, second language? Or do we really need to rethink that concept of first and second language and think about literally how is languaging functioning cognitively? That's where the research is. That's where the research is in terms of applied linguistics, in terms of psycholinguistics, and in language education. Probably the most interesting right now in the middle. So what does that mean for language educators? And this is the question I'm going to keep coming back to. If this is language, Or is this languages? What does that mean for us in our teaching designs? Do we think about language or do we think about semiotic resources? And you may ask, well, then what do you mean by semiotic resources? But again, I'm going to trace back some ideas that have been discussed for more than 2 decades, but that are now pushing at us in the right where we design our teaching. What we often talk about is multimodality. We make meaning with more than language. We use visuals. I've been gesturing. There's a number of different resources we can use. Touch. Okay. Different resources we can use to communicate, to make meaning. And we have always used a range of resources. The idea that we would study language separately or learn language without thinking about the other resources we use is really what linguists did 100 years ago. But if we're interested in communication, if we're interested in meaning, we use more. However, things have changed. They changed continuously throughout the 20th century, and they continue to change, not because of technology, but with technology. And you can think of your cell phones, and you can think of how you message people, and you can think about the place of the image. Once upon a time, if you opened a textbook, for example, there would be the writing and a picture, and the meaning would be roughly the same. Nowadays, they won't be, and probably they haven't been for about 20 years. What you see are complementary meanings. That is, what is in the picture is additional to what's in the writing. What's in the writing is additional to what's in the image. And most interestingly, depending on what you're looking at, the most important information may not be in the language. It may be in the image. So are we teaching people to communicate within a culture using the resources of that culture? If that's the case, is it enough to be talking about language? Or do we need to be thinking of the ways in which a culture draws on the full set of resources? If I think of a Chinese bow, a Korean bow, and a Japanese bow, none of them are the same. The physical embodiment of the bow is quite different. And how I do the bow is communicating something about the relationship between people. Can I teach greetings and not teach the embodiment of the greeting? Am I handicapping people by ignoring the full range of resources? But let's look at this from teaching. This is a EAL classroom with high school students who have been in an English dominant country for less than a year. They're going to get a year of extra support, and then they are going into mainstream English classes. And their parents have sent them to Canada, and this is from Canada again, because they want them to enter a prestigious English-speaking university. These are young people who have a tremendous amount of pressure on them. Family obligations, the financial weight, the emotional distance. And extraordinary teachers work with students in those situations. What you're seeing is the work of high school students and the work of a very skillful teacher who takes short stories. She's retired now, but who would take required short stories for someone like me who grew up in Canada and carefully scaffolds the students in analyzing the story through images and creating mandalas. And so these are students who have been in Canada for less than a year, analyzing and doing the work of mainstream English Canadians. Again, you may say, what does this have to do with foreign language setting? We've got these complications of multiple modes of meaning that may impact our classrooms, but why am I showing you this particular pedagogic example? Well, let's think about some of what's going on here. Kress, again, a key theorist in multimodality, talks about translation as a process of moving meaning. But we know that grammar translation really isn't that effective in learning a language. It has its moments, perhaps, but it does not, as we have seen, support the majority in being able to work in and through a language. Now, transduction is a subset of translation, but a bit different in the sense that it's about taking language and doing the meaning shifts into the image and then doing something else again with language. And why that's important is we make meaning differently with images. So you have to think really hard about language to capture the ideas somehow in an image. What you saw in the earlier image was a teacher doing that work in an English-speaking setting. What you see here is current research by one of my PhD students in a Japanese high school classroom south of Tokyo in what in Japan would be a relatively small community. And what students in this high school class are doing, and he's going through cycles of design work with other teachers as well, is they're taking the readings in a Japanese English language textbook, and the students are then drawing what they're reading. In this case, it's about Rowling and Harry Potter. And he has them reading and drawing and discussing and then designing. And then they are creating augmented reality interpretations of the information to be shared with their families. So they're moving from a classic Japanese textbook reading through the transduction of getting it into image, then discussing it in English, although actually they translanguage, that's what the data says, designing then an augmented reality that is for others. Think of what that's demanding in terms of their English language. Think of how carefully the design work is being done to further their English language development. So that's current research going on now. Van Leuven is another key theorist in multimodality. This idea of should we be talking about the full semiotic range of students and developing that, or do we talk only about language? In a special issue of Teasel Quarterly in 2015, which I co-edited, he did the response to the articles, thinking about the kinds of questions we need to be engaging with as educators and as researchers and as educational linguists. Do we pretend that students already know how all of these other resources work, or do we need to be explicit? Do we need to have ways of helping them to work with these other resources, just like we do language? What does it mean to move across? How do we balance this idea of valorizing their identities, recognizing that what they put into this, but also knowing what they have to cope with beyond our classrooms? I do a very good Japanese bow. I can embody, Korean. I've lived in South Korea. My Japanese bow is actually my worst. My Chinese is better than my Japanese. I know I miscommunicate when I bow. Should that be part of my understanding of how we communicate? What does that mean for you if you are a teacher or a researcher in the field of language education? And then we have the digital. And the digital, if you communicate online, you're talking to computers and to bots. And me, as someone who is relatively skilled in English, I have very annoying conversations with computers. I had one with my power company last week. It's a different way of using language. And digital, of course, is the work of the image. And this is work in a year 5-6 class during the pandemic, during lockdown, and things that they were writing and sharing and interpreting. Again, you see images. Now, it's interesting to think about being online like this. Some of you will have taught online. You're online now, putting up with me. You will have been online listening to others. At the end of, let's say, the school year in 2020, and certainly you will hear universities around the world quite proud of themselves in terms of how they coped with all this, moving online. Students proud of themselves as well. How successful were we? Well, you also know that there's great concern about young people staying in school this year because of the impact of not being in school during the various closures and shutdowns. I'm going to show you some data from PISA, which is the big international comparison of education in the kindergarten to grade 12. And if you're in schools, PISA data acts on you very directly because that's where a lot of this talk of standards comes from. And what it's showing is that, that online was one of the things that changes. It wasn't optional and this temporary business, and it exploded. But if we look at what was going on even before the pandemic, here's the impact of use of technologies on student learning, as studied in this big, well-funded government studies internationally. Look at the positive impact of a data projector, a screen, on reading, on math, on science, a network computer. Look at a tablet. A negative impact on educational outcomes. And the laptop, no difference. Think about what the data projector and the internet connected computer mean in terms of teaching. It's the interaction. And as language educators know that learning depends on interaction. Silence. Silence is often when we know our students have the least opportunities to learn and develop language. Same technologies, look at it by area of the world. Data projector, big impact on educational outcomes. Positive changes. Interactive whiteboards only made a difference in Europe. Positive impact, negative everywhere else. Laptops had a positive impact in North America, negative everywhere else. And as someone who has taught on 3 continents, I can tell you that laptops are used very differently in different settings, communicative practices, use of language. And that goes to the larger point that when we're talking about working digitally, we may or may not have prepared educators, including language educators, to do that, to design for learning. That assumptions are made about what the learner knows, what the teacher knows, not just about the designing of the pedagogy, but the technology itself. And we see those differences playing out in ways that often are negative for students. So what's key when we're talking about technologies? What are the things that are challenging our ideas of language? We need to know how language is used online to further education. We don't just need to know that people can communicate online. We need to know how to set up language use so that it furthers learning, and more particularly, language learning. And so you see, and these are examples of areas of research, studies into the pragmatics of key pals, not just introducing favorite food, but really thinking about what it is that we have to do in the language, the complexity, to further learning, to understand how projects, if artfully designed, engage students in language. And as always, how do we do that in ways that further grammatical competence, vocabulary, and awareness? Because we know those correlate with language development. But this digital language and this way of using language digitally is another thing. Just a project I'm working on with a colleague in Germany, where we are trying to understand how we can create partnerships that cross different levels of education. And so we have students in elementary schools in Germany doing these, which are a plurilingual portrait. And there's research on these. They're fairly simple. What's interesting is that we have these young learners in German schools, and we have student teachers in a university in Germany, and then we have MA students in Lancaster, all involved in the same project, but doing different things. And by doing different things, using language differently and scaffolding each other. And so we have a plurilingual portrait unit created by the student teachers who teach it in the elementary school, and the MA students who use Skype to interview the elementary school students about their portrait and about their languages. And of course, that interview is in English usually, but sometimes there's translanguaging. And then undergraduate students and MA students using the data from those interactions to write coursework. Think of genre, register, discourses. Think of what this is doing for the student teachers and for the MA students. Think about what it also does for the elementary students. To social justice, which is a key topic internationally right now, given the turmoil of the last few years. Jim Cummins has been writing about language education for more than 40 years, bilingual education certainly for 20, and talking about that anyone who works in our field of language education understands we're talking about challenging certain power relations within a society. Languages are used to keep people down and to lift people up. And language teachers get accused of doing both those things. Long ago, Michael Holliday, one of the two top linguists of the 20th century, said that, we need to think of language as a semiotic system. It's systems of meanings. And it's not just systems of meanings, it's what we use to create meaning. The meaning we can make of the world, the meaning we can make in the world, has to do with the linguistic, semiotic resources that are available to us. If we take that perspective of language, that our role as language educators is to expand how people are able to mean and make mean by themselves and with others in the world, what does that mean for our teaching? What does that understanding of language mean for how we design our pedagogy? Because that's looking at language in use, but language as use. That the primary way to consider language is how it's getting used and how it's getting things done in societies. Means that we are thinking about meaning as primary. And that challenges a lot of what we do historically as language educators. The idea that are people being systematically discriminated against if we deny them access to their meaning-making resources? Because there are certainly people making that argument in the United States quite loudly right now, that to deny access is an issue of systemic discrimination. What does it mean, this languages as they're used, this kind of mixing it up that I've been showing you, the consideration of the non-linguistic resources? What does that mean in terms of how we judge correctness? Thinking of all that marking you do, what does it mean in terms of the assignments you give and how you mark? And is even talking about the appropriateness of the depth of my bow a form of cultural hegemony? That may seem far-fetched for some of you who are still dealing with the grammar test. But these are the questions that are being put to language educators globally. The Van Leuven question, are we balancing? Do we get a little bit carried away with that? It's not my question, but we've got the cultural and societal values we're attempting to advance, but then we have the realities our students are going to face. How are we balancing that out? How do these changing understandings of language affect how we do that balancing in our teaching? And of course, where's English in all of this? My personal opinion, and having been someone who is taught, as I said, on 3 continents, that it's the challenges that face someone who is teaching a foreign language, which is what English is in Japan, are even more acute than the challenges of someone who is teaching a language in, for example, the UK. And that's because it's English. And because English is what you have to get a good exam score on to get your foot in the right door of a company, or to have those opportunities to work in international development, or to take up certain places in the world. This English as a lingua franca, do these understandings of language change the amount of value we want to attach to this English and the doors it's open? Or do we need to be practical and say our students deserve the opportunity to open those doors? When you study an MA or when you study a PhD, you want to be in an environment where people are asking you these kinds of questions. Because what any educator is a designer of opportunities to learn. And sure, you can learn how to do a certain kind of task, and that's important, that kind of task design. But it's also important to think of how that task design fits in to the larger issues around language that don't have answers, but that we need to be thinking about as we design. And these are the changing ideas of language that are impacting on those of us with an interest in language education. Now, this is a taster lecture of what you might encounter at Lancaster, but you'll notice I've put a question mark on that. If you're in my classroom, I'm not staring at a classroom, at a camera. I'm looking at you. I'm looking to see if you understand. I'm looking to see if your face is confused. Be amazed how the furrows in the brow help me understand where to explain more, where to slow things down. The joy of seeing an aha on a student's face where they get something. The wonder of watching people from very different parts of the world discuss with each other how they're struggling or how they're making sense of things in their context. This is a taster lecture, but this isn't how it would feel in my classroom, because I would be talking with you and I would know your name and I would know your learning history, and I would know where you've taught before, and I'd be learning something about the students you taught, and we'd be talking about these things together. In small groups, in large group, we work together. And I don't talk at you, nor do most of the lecturers at Lancaster. We don't talk at you. We work with you. So this is a taster lecture, but it's a kind of funny sample because it doesn't taste what you would taste if you were here. And so as part of this taster lecture, I also want to welcome you to join us, to struggle with some of these questions with us, and to research in ways that engage you in these global discussions. So thank you very much. I'm to put my email address up on the screen so that you have it, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Potts. It was a great presentation. I feel like I'm back to a university student and just finished one big lesson. Thank you very much. So right now, we're having some questions. 質問のある方、すでに送っていただいている方もいると思うんですけれども、追加で質問がしたいという方がいらっしゃいましたら、チャットボックスでお気軽に質問を投げていただければと思います。The first question いきますね。Does Lancaster University accept duolingo score instead of IELTS?
Sally can probably answer this better than I can if she's still here. We accept, yeah, go for it. I know what we did last year, but.
Yeah, so we did potentially accepted last year. We're not this year if we did last year, unfortunately. So we'd be looking for the academic IELTS or IELTS for the non-academic route. You can find, I'll post a link to our website where you can find the full list of what we're looking for and what we accept. Not Duolingo, unfortunately. If your IELTS don't quite reach the level that is required, the score that's required, you can do one of our pre-sessional courses. So you'd be invited to do that if you just miss the entry requirements. But I will drop a link into the chat box so you can see what we accept. But it's mainly just the IELTS that we're looking for.
And the reason for that is we want to make sure if you come to our department that you succeed. It is horrible teaching students whose language capacities have not prepared them for the masters. It's horrible, and it's horrible taking their money. So we're very careful in where we set our entrance requirements, and we are confident because we've actually done the statistical work in the department that if you make it in, you will succeed. You've got the language, you've got the abilities, you will be a successful MA student in our department. And so that's the reason that we set the standard we do in our department. We've carefully analyzed what linguistic capacity allows a person to excel as a master's student.
Thank you so much. 今、サリーさんから皆さんにリンクを送ってくださいましたけど、Zoom のセッションが終わったらこのチャットボックスも自動的に消えてしまいますので、URL 保存したい方は今クリックしておいていただけるといいかなと思います。IELTS の他にもTOEFL もアクセプトしてるみたいなので、ぜひチェックしてみてください。The next question いきますね。Thank you for taking time and giving us this presentation. My question for you is that, do you have graduate students with family accompanied?
Yes. Would you like to know how many of my PhD students have had a baby in the last 18 months? And that means fathers and mothers. We have had MA students have a baby while they're doing their dissertation. Yes, is the simple answer. The university has family accommodation. So, you can apply for family accommodation. People make use of the childcare facilities on campus, which have an outstanding rating by the government. Most people find, I think, close communities of other families who have children. But quite seriously, 4 of my PhD students have had a baby in the last 18 months. They have to show me baby pictures before we talk about their thesis. So children are more than welcome. And actually, one of them is studying her children's multilingual development right now, one of my Chilean PhD students. So Bonnie Norton, if you know Bonnie Norton's work, Bonnie Norton is the one who brought the notion of identity into applied linguistics and language education. She's, I forget how many awards she's won internationally, but her children were born while she was doing her PhD student, and her PhD thesis, and she has stories about them playing at her feet. And she always said it made them better kids because they saw her work very hard from a very young age. So yes, families are very welcome in that sense.
Thank you very much. And the next question is also for Professor Potts. What's the difference between MA Applied Linguistics and MA TESOL?
Yes, that's a very good question. And the honest answer is, if you're comparing universities, don't pay attention to the names. Look at what the modules are and look at what kinds of dissertations students are writing. You'll see that we've combined the two into a single degree. And that's because in the context of our program, some will go off in a more applied linguistics direction. And often that means more second language acquisition, what we would still call second language acquisition. So looking at issues of identity, they may be looking at doing psycholinguistic studies. So they will link to what Whittleson always said, with applied linguistics is not linguistics applied. It is about studying how language is being used in the world, and that we don't learn just in classrooms. So that those larger sets of issues often fall under the heading of applied linguistics. TESOL is specifically interested, is much more so interested in teaching. So TESOL is teaching. And so you see a different set of research questions being asked if the primary interest is the teaching of language in contrast to the acquisition and learning of language. At an MA level, what you want is especially if you're thinking of PhD studies, but not only, you want to be engaging with the research literature. You want it to be more than a how to teach. Because if you really want to know how to teach, my honest advice is take a Bachelor of Education in a good university for that purpose. But an MA is about learning to ask the questions and to design, not just the how-to of the instructions. And applied linguistics takes you in one direction, and teaching takes you in another direction when you start to do that dissertation.
Thank you very much. The next question is, thank you for today's presentation, Professor. What do you think are the pros and cons, if there are any, about getting a master's degrees in the UK for international students?
I think there's several. And I will answer you based on my experience of teaching Japanese MA students. I think one of the first things they will say is that, that they encounter language, how it is taught outside of Japan. So you've got an education ministry, you've got sets of textbooks, you have the way that English is built into the education system in Japan. You talk to other teachers in Japan. To step outside of Japan and talk with people who talk about language education differently is eye-opening. And I think it's eye-opening for anyone who steps outside of their own country. I think for the way that English language has functioned in Japan, it seems to be particularly eye-opening. And it's almost December where it's like, it starts to come together in terms of really being able to see possibilities for Japan from talking with not just academics, not just me. And that goes to the other part of studying overseas, is the conversations you get to have with people that you wouldn't have gotten to have any other way. And academics are part of that, but your peers, the breadth of the peer relationships, the depth of the peer relationships. My student who's a teacher in a Tokyo high school who's doing his PhD in language socialization, and the way that native English speaker classrooms function in comparison to the JET classrooms. What happens? How do they socialize each other? That group, I can't keep track of how close they are, because there's about 12 of them who are still in constant contact. And that was 6-7 years ago when they did their MAs together. So those relationships that become professional networks, and Bunya, who I'm talking about, has presented internationally in England and in the United States. So Japanese students come and experience something, but then they also give back globally. And that taking and giving is part of what one gains from networking internationally. And that to me is what's key. That and reading the research, because you never have time to read the research when you're teaching. You learn to read the research, and reading the research in contrast to the how to makes such a difference in one's teaching when one goes back to the classroom. Do you want me just to keep reading questions and answering, or I've got the question box open, so I'm not sure if anything comes in from the multiple channels. I know there's a question about scholarships and studentships. There are a small number. The UK is, in fairness, there's not a lot of money for MAs to study in the UK. But again, Sally, if you want to direct them to the university page and also to the department page, we have, I think, 3 MA studentships in the department, highly competitive, but they're there, and they do sometimes go to international students. They will only cover your tuition at a UK fees level, though. So they cover fees costed at a UK level. And so there's a difference. If we're talking about the department studentships, there's a difference between what it costs a UK student and an international student that still has to be bridged.
On a wider university level, we are in the process of finalising our global scholarship scheme, which will be applicable to PG students. We're in the process. I can't give you any exacts right now, but as soon as we have that, we'll share it with SIUK and they can share it by email with all of you. The great thing, and please correct me if I'm wrong, because it might be different on departmental level, Dan, but a great thing about a lot of the scholarships at Lancaster is there's no need for a separate application. So you don't have to worry about doing your application to apply to Lancaster and your application for your scholarship. The admissions team will take a look at your academic transcript and then pass it on to the academics in your department, and they'll consider whether you're eligible for a scholarship. So normally it's less work for you. You don't have to do any separate applications, which is great. But once we have the information finalized, we'll definitely send that out via email to SIUK.
Well, and your question about studentships has now helped Sally and I, because Sally, I would also say then to talk to the people in the scholarships committees in the departments to standardize the forms, because if they know that's a possibility, they'll work towards it. So we'll try and make it even easier for you. No one wants to make it difficult. No one wants to make the application process difficult. And if you contact our academic coordinators in the department, I think I can say this, and we hire people who are good at helping students. That's our priority when we hire in our department. And I can guarantee you it'll be very personal support you receive if you contact one of the academic coordinators. They're brilliant. I've got some student 6 in terms of working as an English. If you're working as an English language teacher in Japan, you will thrive in our program. And I say that because I have taught at least a dozen Japanese high school teachers who have come and done our program. So I can say with great confidence that the education degree and the experience put you in a very good position, both to learn and to help others learn. And I am really curious to see the new textbook series, because I understand the 7-year cycle, you've got new textbooks coming. So having someone who can update us on what's going on in Japan, not just from CLIL, because I have a pretty good sense of what's going on with CLIL, but in other areas, you'd be terrific to have in our department. So I'm not sure who student 6 is, but that would be my answer to their question.
The language-based background is necessary. So students who don't have any background for language cannot apply for your course, MA courses. Am I correct?
Language can be interpreted generously. If you think about all the ways that we deal with and work with language, we will, so if someone's working in language education, but their degree is unrelated to language education or unrelated to language and linguistics, that's fine. The experience more than compensates for what wasn't in the degree. In the MA Applied Linguistics and TESOL program and the Masters in Language and Literacy, people do apply, and in their transcript, it's evident that they've worked with language in some way, because depending on the country and depending on the university, the classes that might be in a British university in applied linguistics might be in communication or something else. what's classified as psychology in Japan is very different than what's under the umbrella of psychology in North America. So the experience and sort of the looking at the transcript and making sense of what you've studied, that's key. Together, if it doesn't look straightforward, don't think we'll reject you. They'll send it to the department for us to look at closely, and we'll make an interpretation of your background and see whether we think there's a good fit. But things get named differently in different countries. And so the name isn't what's important. It's what you've done both educationally and experience-wise. So we have people who've worked in media and communication studies as well.
It's worth noting as well that maybe if you're a bit apprehensive about your application, if you don't want to apply or have SIUK help you apply through our PG system online, you can always send an email to our admissions team and they'll just take a look at your application and your transcript before you apply and give you a clear indication of whether you will or will not be accepted, and they could pass it on to Diane or someone else in the department. So it saves you then having to go through the process of applying if you don't think you'll be accepted. But like Dan said, there's a lot of flexibility and interpretations of your academic history.
Yeah, if you're going to make it work as a global organization, you understand that things look differently in different places in the world. That's part of being global. And Lancaster understands itself as a global institution. So it's not a quick look and a check. It's a let's really read this and see what the person brings to the program.
Right, thank you so much. そろそろお時間が来たんですけれども、他に質問大丈夫ですか？ YouTube からご質問少しいただいてるんですけど、ちょっと時間があれなので、また10月の15日の金曜日に行うオンライン留学フェアにランカスター大学の担当官サリーさんがお越しになってくださいますので、直接IELTS のスコアだったりとか奨学金のことだったりとか聞きたいという方は留学フェアにぜひお越しいただいて直接面談をしてみてください。留学フェアなんですけれども、10月15日にランカスター大学が来ますので、今、フェアのリンクをお送りしたんですけれども、直接 IELTS だったりとか、奨学金のことだったりとか、聞きたいっていう方は、ぜひ、担当官のサリーさんと直接面談をして、いろいろ聞いてみてください。では、
Maybe one thing I might also add for people who are thinking about what they want to do. We quite regularly connect someone who is considering studying with us with someone who has studied with us. So we ask one of our alumni if they'd be willing to talk with you or email with you, and we connect you, and then we stay out of the conversation because we want you to have an honest opinion. We want you to know what we're like. We want you to choose us because you want to be with us and because you want to be part of us, to be part of our network and our alumni and learners. So if at some point you would want to talk to someone who studied with us, just let us know and we'll arrange that. And I can think of one of the students that's going to be starting this year who spent a couple of hours talking with a former graduate, making sure it was the right school for her. So we'd be more than happy to connect you with someone in Japan who has studied with us.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation, Professor Potts. And thank you so much, Sally. ではこれで、ランカスター大学で言語学を学ぼうのオンラインセミナーを終了させていただきます。本日は皆さんお越しくださいまして誠にありがとうございました。留学フェアのご予約もお待ちしております。どうぞよろしくお願いいたします。Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Diane.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's a genuine joy to have students from Japan, and I hope we'll be seeing some of you, if not next year, the year after that.
では、ありがとうございました。これで失礼いたします。さよなら。